Good afternoon. So glad everyone's here to join us today. My name is Adam Alfrey. I'm the Assistant Director for Historical Services here at Knox County Public Library, and we're so glad you're here with us to finish out our Fall Genealogy program series. This series was made possible through a partnership between the East Tennessee Historical Society and the Knox County Public Library, so we appreciate all the team members who have worked to put this on. And it was supported by some folks that are really special to us as well. The Friends of Knox County Public Library, also East Tennessee BPS, and also our partners at Community Media Knoxville. They do a great job of recording these presentations and making them accessible for the future. So all those folks go behind the scenes to make this really possible and happen. So we express our appreciation to all of them. No doubt, as you're interested in the topic at hand, military history, and especially as it impacts interpretation of genealogy, I did want to make you aware of a new program that came online just last week, thanks to one of our team members here in the audience with us, Zachary Keith. He's been digitizing our military discharge records known as DD-214s. That's a really important local record because if you know the story of that record group, is it 1973? Is that correct? That there was a fire at the Record Center in St. Louis where about 80% of the World War I and World War II records were destroyed. However, if they were filed locally, those records still exist. So
also Vietnam.
Correct. So we hold DD-214s from the Civil War all the way up through Vietnam if they were filed locally. So visit our website. Zach is writing some bios on some of the individuals, the veterans that and telling their stories so you get a sense of what information is held in that record group. So it's a really a great resource and an interesting read at the same time. So please take a look at those. Without further ado, it's my honor to introduce our speaker today, Myers Brown. Myers has formerly worked at the Tennessee State Museum, at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. He's a former president of the Tennessee Association of Museums, and I count him among my good colleagues and friends. We've got to work on a number of projects over the year, and it's truly an honor to have him with us today. At this portion of the introduction, I usually make a Vanderbilt joke because he's a Vanderbilt fan, but after what UT did this weekend, I have nothing left to say other than please join me in welcoming Myers Brown, Director of Belmont Mansion.
Well, UT will still beat Vanderbilt, so I think you're in good shape there. Now, Belmont's women's basketball team may give you a fits, though. They beat Georgia on Friday night, if you didn't catch that news. I'm always happy to be here at the East Tennessee History Center. I love being in Knoxville. For many years, both at the State Museum, the State Library and Archives, I was a field service agent, so I traveled all over our great state multiple times, and I do miss doing that. But let me tell you a little bit about Belmont Mansion. Belmont Mansion, if you've never been there, was completed in 1853, a major addition added to it in 1860. It was the largest home built in Tennessee prior to the Civil War. It was the home of the Adelicia Ackland. That was her second husband. She would be married 3 times, but it is full of fantastic decorative arts. And if anybody knows me, I'm not a decorative arts person, so people go, why on earth did you end up there? Well, that's because it was also the headquarters of the 4th Army Corps for 2 weeks during the Battle of Nashville, which I have 4th Army Corps hats if you would like to purchase one when we're done. So it is a significant part of the Battle of Nashville. But this is an image taken of it in the 1880s. It was 20,000 square feet, 39 rooms, surrounded by formal gardens, and informal gardens in addition. So if you've never been to Belmont Mansion, I encourage you to come visit us. We are in the heart of Belmont University's campus, and the university owns the building, but it's actually a private nonprofit that runs the mansion. So I'm technically the only employee of the nonprofit that is actually also an employee of the university. So I have 2 hats and answer to 2 different bosses, which can be fun at times, but not so fun at other times. But my background is really in military history. And for many years, I served as the curator of military history at the Atlanta History Center, then went to General Joe Wheeler's home site in North Alabama, and even when I was at the State Museum, I didn't get very far away from military subjects, primarily dealing with 18th and 19th century topics. But what we're going to do today is kind of go through some terminology that you might see going through records that either is antiquated by our terminology or terms that are misconfused, misunderstood. I hope to leave a lot of time at the end for questions because there's no way that I could begin to talk about all the different terms that you might encounter going through genealogical records. Let's start with the most basic thing, though. The regular Army. A lot of people will get this confused. They will see RA. Well, that stands for Regular Army, or called the Regulars. That are the full-time standing army of the United States. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the regular army was extremely small. Even during the Civil War, when the army blossoms and gets larger and larger and larger, the regular army still remains relatively small compared to the volunteer forces that will augment that. And the standing or the theory behind small standing armies comes out of the American Revolution, where the Founding Fathers had a fear of standing armies. And so it was the mindset throughout the 19th century is that you keep the regular army small and then you don't have to worry about military dictatorships. However, when you do get into conflict, you have to have troops. And if you have a small regular army, then you also have to have something else to supply troops in those instances. And this is where the state militias come in. And every state has a state militia in the 18th and 19th century, and even into the early 20th century, or at least a version of it in some cases. And usually, and these state laws varied, but normally every able-bodied male between the ages of 17 and 45 could be or should be enrolled in the state militia. You did not have a choice about it. If you were a citizen, you were automatically enrolled in the state militia. You could be exempt if you had some sort of health issue, but generally you were enrolled in the militia. Most of those state militia laws also required, if you're going to have a citizen army, they have to also have firearms. And so by most state laws, they were required to have a firearm and also the ammunition and accoutrements that went along with making that weapon usable. You were also supposed to have some ready-made ammunition so that if you got called up, you didn't have to sit around and roll cartridges. You could go immediately into service, although it's kind of funny that some state laws required only you to have 3 rounds ready to be made. So you might be ready to go for a couple of minutes in a battle, but you're going to have to have some time to make some cartridges. I will also add, though, that some people could not own a firearm, not for legal reasons, but they simply couldn't afford one. So that was also why the state militia laws often required that each state keep an armory somewhere, in some cases multiple armories, where there would be weapons that were provided by the federal government that could be issued out. This becomes increasingly important because so many of our Tennesseans wanted to carry their hunting rifles off to war, and while those were great for hunting deer, they weren't necessarily what you wanted if you're going up against the British. Wasn't a bad weapon, but it was not really intended for military purposes. Other states also required you to have a bayonet. If you didn't have a bayonet, you had to have a tomahawk or a sword, some sort of edged weapon to go along with it. And under most state militia laws, you were required to turn out and drill at least 4 times a year. Now, I use that term drill very loosely because about half the time they would show up, take roll, drill for about 15 minutes, and then drink corn liquor and have a dance for the rest of the afternoon. So were they well drilled? Well, it just depended on who the local militia commander was and how true he was to discipline. But you also have to remember that local militia commanders were actually elected. which creates a real problem if you're trying to enforce discipline. If you got a bunch of guys that you have to enforce discipline on, and then you have to depend on them to reelect you to office, sometimes the officers themselves were the ones providing the corn liquor to make sure they got reelected. So keep that in mind as well. They could be called up for local, regional, or national emergencies. And again, the state laws varied. And to give you a good example of that, during the War of 1812, when we're trying to get at the British, there would be 13 different attempts to invade Canada during the War of 1812. Well, the first attempt was really our best option because a lot of the Canadians didn't even realize the war had been declared at that point. The problem was the New York State Militia marched up to the New York state line and refused to step across the border because technically the state law said they are there to defend the state of New York and therefore cannot be used for offensive purposes. So there's all kinds of problems with the militia. Everybody realized this in the 19th century, none more so than General Andrew Jackson, who was trying to keep an army together throughout the War of 1812, and his militia kept going home. However, Jackson can't afford to change the militia laws because, as the militia commander, that is block votes. And so you can't afford to make the militia captains angry by changing the militia laws. So it's not until 1905 that we finally get somebody that says this is ridiculous, and that's when we start to see the change in the creation of the National Guard. So, also during times of emergency, if the militia were not doing the job, then you could raise volunteer units. And this gets really, really confusing, particularly early on, because they were raised under state authority, but some or all of their funding would come from federal sources. So then that becomes a difficult situation to explain. Do they report to the governor of the state, or do they report to the War Department in Washington? And it never really got cleared up completely until you get, again, the 1905 National Guard rules. However, the volunteers were more reliable than the militia because in order to be in a state volunteer regiment, you had to voluntarily step up and sign the documents. It wasn't like the militia where you were automatically enrolled. Okay? And typically their term of enlistment is longer than militia. Volunteer is important for our state because this is during the War of 1812 when we first started getting the nickname the Volunteer State. It will be stamped on us permanently when we get to the Mexican-American War, but regardless, this is when it starts, is in the War of 1812. Now, we also will have in Tennessee and a few other states as well, state guard units. So you might see that. The state guard is entirely different from the militia system. It's entirely different from volunteers. It is essentially a state army. And the most famous state army that we raised here in Tennessee was during Reconstruction when Governor Brownlow felt like he needed additional troops to make sure that the former Confederates didn't rebel again. So we have a state army for a while that is called the State Guard. And most of them, the officers are actually composed of former volunteer officers from the Civil War. But we are one of only 2 states that remain that still have a state guard on the books. South Carolina is the other one. They fall outside the National Guard system, and they do fall under the Adjutant General of the state of Tennessee, but really what they are used for is very rarely are they used for combat. But let's say we did have a national emergency and all of our National Guard is called off to go deal with something else. Theoretically, the State Guard could be called up to deal with local security, things like that. So occasionally you do see the State Guard floating around, and they do drill occasionally. It's a relatively small body, but it does exist. And then, of course, the National Guard, we're probably all familiar with. They report to the respective state governors, but also the Department of the Army via the National Guard Bureau, and then they become nationalized, which is what's happened first Gulf War, then war on terrorism, which is why our friends and neighbors often get sent off to foreign lands. So, everybody thoroughly confused now? All right. Good. It's the way intended. Now, I wanted to demonstrate this because this is two mannequins from our 1812 exhibit, which was hosted here at the East Tennessee History Center. And Adam spent a lot of time building them a trench line. I don't know if you remember that if you were around. But this shows you a U.S. regular Army soldier at the time of the War of 1812. And then this is either a Tennessee militiaman or it could also be a Tennessee volunteer. He is he's wearing civilian clothes, acts as a civilian weapon. But again, his salary, if he's in the volunteers, is being supplemented by the federal government. Now, on to my favorite topic, and this is where everybody really gets confused. Let me ask this question before I switch sides. How many of you ever heard the term dragoon?
Dragoon.
Dragoon. Yep. How many of you ever heard the term mounted infantry?
Yep.
All right, then the term cavalry. Yep. All right, three different terms, three different sources for the terms, but here in the U.S., it gets really, really mixed bag, okay? So, dragoons, technically, that is a French term that the French came up with that indicated that they were soldiers on horseback that were trained to fight on horseback and on foot. So it gives them a great deal of mobility, right? The theory was they could draw sabers and fight from horseback, but if they needed somewhere on the battlefield, they could ride to that point on the battlefield and dismount and fight on the ground, much like an infantry soldier. Well, the British and the Americans take that term that they thought was really, really cool, and of course we mess it all up. So, when you read dragoon in the terms of the Revolutionary War, you'll see Washington's Light Dragoons, you'll see the 4th Dragoons, you'll see the 17th Light Dragoons on the British side at places like Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. Those guys are called dragoons both on the American and the British side, but most of them are only carrying sabers and pistols. Does that make them an effective soldier for fighting on the ground?
No.
No, because an effective range of a pistol in the 18th century is about from me to that wall right there. So it's not an effective theory to make dragoons only have pistols and sabers. Occasionally they might have some sort of short carbine, but regardless, when you read 18th century stuff in terms of the American and British Army, and you read dragoons, keep in mind these are not using the strict terminology of the French, okay? Now, we really, really like that term dragoon here in the U.S. So after the war, the Revolutionary War, and we're creating our own nation and our own army now, we create first the U.S. Legions, and the Legions are kind of a mixed bag. They are a combination of infantry units, dragoons, and artillery all serving together in a very, very small way. So like we had legions down at Fort Southwest Point and then Tellico Blockhouse. Those are the legions that are serving those in the late 1780s, 1790s. Well, that system doesn't work either. So that system went by the wayside, and then after that, we're going to have a major gutting of the Army and try to recreate it. So in 1808, the Army is kind of reconstituted, doing away with the Legion system, but we're now going to have dragoon regiments created again, the first U.S. Dragoons, and they will serve through the War of 1812. Again, dragoon, strictly meaning that they were able to fight on the ground or on horseback, but in reality, they're only carrying sabers and pistols. So they're fighting like light cavalry, if you will, okay? We finally get rid of cavalry altogether because Congress is notoriously cheap when in times of peace when it comes to military spending, at least in the 19th century they were. So we got rid of all the mounted forces entirely after the War of 1812. But what's happening after the War of 1812 is the country continues to grow westward, and the more westward we grow, the more we encounter Native Americans on open plains. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever done the math, but if you're on horseback and you're being pursued by an infantryman, you're never going to be caught. So it made it very, very difficult for our boys out on the frontier to deal with Indians that are on horseback. So it takes until 1833 when Congress finally comes up with a little money and decides to recreate the 1st Dragoon Regiment. Now, 1st Dragoons are not enough, so a few years later they create the 2nd Dragoons. Now keep in mind, these guys, newly created, they now have pistols, sabers, and they've added to their mix a short carbine. However, they fight, if given the choice, most of the time from horseback. They are trained to fight on foot. So we're getting a little bit back to the old terminology of a dragoon, right? Then the Mexican War erupts, and now things get really even more confusing. So in the 1840s, we're going to temporarily add a 3rd Dragoon Regiment. And by the way, James K. Polk's younger brother was the lieutenant colonel of that regiment. I think it's convenient that his older brother was the president at the time. But then that regiment goes away after the Mexican War. They're not really needed. But at the same time, or just slightly before that, we're going to add a regiment of mounted rifles. So the question is, how is a mounted rifle different from a dragoon? At least in theory.
They only fight on horseback.
What?
They only fight on horseback.
A mounted rifle?
No, they're carrying rifles.
They're carrying rifles.
For the
If
mounted infantry.
If you were true to the terminology, they are dragoons,
Yeah.
right? They are carrying rifles, they're carrying pistols, they've got sabers, right? So theoretically, they should be dragoons. But no, we have to create something different. And so we're going to create the Regiment of Mounted Rifles. And they are given Mississippi rifles. They were actually created to guard the Oregon Trail. But because of the Mexican-American War, they're shipped to Mexico. And then after that, they actually do manage to guard the Oregon Trail in the late 1840s, early 1850s. So in the 1850s, we're going to make it even more confusing because there is a new Secretary of War that you may have heard of named Jefferson Davis, who thinks we need cavalry regiments now, right? So now, in the 1850s, we have, if you're keeping count, the 1st and 2nd U.S. Dragoons, the Mounted Rifles, the 1st U.S. Cavalry, and the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, okay? For all intents and purposes, they're all trained the same, they all have similar arms, and they're all kind of doing the same job. But we got 5 regiments with different names. It's ridiculous. So when does it get changed? Well, finally, in the midst of the Civil War, right after the Civil War began, in August of 1861, somebody in the War Department went, this is absolutely ridiculous. We got mounted rifles, we got dragoons, we got cavalry, they're all doing the same thing. So what do? They rename them all cavalry regiments, but here's even more confusion. The 1st Cavalry lost its name because for seniority reasons, the 1st Cavalry should have been the 1st Dragoons. So the 2nd Cavalry becomes the 2nd, or the 2nd Dragoons become the 2nd Cavalry. The Mounted Rifles become the 3rd Cavalry. The old 1st Cavalry becomes the 4th. You get the picture. Confused? Yeah. When I'm reading about these guys in the antebellum period, I keep a chart so I can keep track of who's who, okay? But finally, we get it all sorted out. So you think, right? Now, so we have this tradition of mounted rifles in the backs of our mind. We also have a tradition of guys on horseback that are carrying their civilian hunting rifles. That goes all the way back to Kings Mountain, right? We have guys under General John Coffee and the East Tennessee mounted gunmen who fought in the War of 1812, who were fighting on horseback but carrying their civilian hunting rifles. So we kind of have a tradition of carrying rifles on horseback, and now we've got the rifle regiment's gone away. But when the Civil War erupts and the Army gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and Union forces in particular are having a difficult time dealing with occupation forces, are having a difficult time with guerrillas and Confederate cavalry raids who are attacking their occupation forces, this is where we now get confusion yet again. So you will have infantry regiments that are given horses. Because again, if you're on occupation duty, the Union Army in, say, Carthage, Tennessee, and you're in an infantry regiment and you get attacked by John Hunt Morgan's raiders and you set out on foot, are you ever going to be able to capture John Hunt Morgan's command? No, right? And it happens all over the state, all over Kentucky as well. So somebody back in Nashville at the Union Army headquarters says, well, I got an idea. Let's let our infantry guys take horses. Well, the problem is you have this numerical numbering system. And you can't now just all of a sudden change their designation. So, one of the most famous mounted infantry units of the entire Civil War is going to be Wilder's Lightning Brigade. It's composed of Indiana and Illinois units. And they had been on occupation duty in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And Wilder gets tired of trying to chase the likes of John Hunt Morgan and Nathan Bedford Forrest and Joe Wheeler, and goes to Rosecrans and says, if you will give me permission to mount my command, I can deal with the problem. And of course, always the problem with raising mounted units is that it's too expensive. Wilder says, I'll take care of that. So what does he do? He goes out and he impresses all of the horses within about a 50-mile radius of Murfreesboro. And within about 3 months, he's managed to completely get his men on horseback. And he is truly effective at tracing down Confederate guerrillas and Confederate cavalry. He even manages to get his command armed with Spencer rifles. But one of those units is the 72nd Indiana Infantry, but every time it's written, it's going to be in parentheses mounted. Okay? And here is a member of Wilder's Lightning Brigade, probably on his stolen horse, but regardless, got his Spencer rifle there. Did get issued saddles by this point, but that's 72nd Indiana Infantry mounted. Okay? Now, as the war goes on, Kentucky and Tennessee will also continue to face these problems. And so the respective governors of those states, particularly Andrew Johnson, in an effort to keep good, loyal East Tennesseans and Middle Tennesseans from being conscripted or drafted into the Union Army and just being sent anywhere, he wants to keep them in the state. So he gets permission to raise truly mounted infantry regiments. Okay? So, one of those units he's going to raise is this one, commanded by Joseph Blackburn of Fentress County, of DeKalb County. And his regiment is going to be the 4th Tennessee Mounted Infantry. Now, because there could also occasionally, you might run into this, 4th Tennessee Mounted Infantry CS, you have to put US behind it. All right? Everybody completely confused again?
Yep.
All right. But this is a illustration from the time period, and it actually shows mounted infantry on horseback. You can tell they're mounted infantry. What's the giveaway?
Rifle.
The rifles, yeah. They got long rifles, not thoroughly equipped as cavalry. And that actually is an image that was done based on Sherman's bombers going through the Carolinas at the end of the war. So temporarily given horses, right? Now, a couple of other terms. And by the way, always make sure you spell cavalry correctly.
How about saying it correctly?
Cavalry, right?
No, cavalry.
Cavalry is troops on horseback. Calvary
For Christ.
is where Christ died. Thank you. I tell my students, I teach college classes every once and again. I tell them if they write a paper and they miss up these terms, it's an automatic F. One kid tried me on it. He knew better. I failed him, and then I gave him extra credit to make up for it. So I am serious about that. So other terms that you might encounter. Artificers is the way it's pronounced. Okay? These guys are only normally found, at least officially, in the Ordnance Department and artillery units. However, unofficially, they also show up in cavalry units. So what are these guys? These are maintenance and repair guys who are highly skilled. And if you want to know about how we know they're highly skilled, they get paid more than the average private. They get paid more, in some instances, more than sergeants. And here's an illustration of the 8th Tennessee Cavalry U.S. of their artificers, again, unofficially in cavalry, but they certainly were there. And all these guys are identified, but you can kind of tell what their roles are within the unit based on the tools and the things they have in their hands. This guy is the saddle maker. That man is a farrier. That man is the blacksmith. And this is just some random sergeant who decided to sit down in the picture with him. At least as far as I could tell, the records don't indicate that he was actually in one of these service roles. But these guys are leather workers, carpenters, saddle makers, wheelwrights. They are the guys who keep these units running. Because what happens if you break a girth strap on your saddle? You got to have somebody to fix it, and fix it quick. You don't have time to send it back to the rear to be fixed. These guys are usually right with their units. If you're traveling down the road and you break a wagon wheel on the caisson, got to be fixed quick. So these are highly skilled guys. A lot of them bring these skills from civilian life into the military, and that's how they end up in these roles. All right? Now, blacksmiths and farriers, everybody knows what a farrier is, right? Yeah, it's a guy who actually shoes horses. A lot of modern folks call everybody who puts shoes on a horse a blacksmith, and true farriers kind of get irritated by that because they are many ways more technically skilled than a blacksmith, at least when it comes to dealing with a horse.
Real quick question, was there a pace scale based on what your skill was, like a farrier more than a blacksmith?
There is. And he asked, if you didn't hear that question, what was the pay scale? And if you want to know those pay scales, I highly recommend picking up the revised, this is from Civil War at least, revised U.S. Army regulations from 1861. There's also the Confederate version. This book has been widely reprinted over the years, and it tells you what everybody makes. It has the pay scale in the back. So blacksmiths and farriers are only found in the ordnance, the artillery, and in cavalry units, okay? That's because they're fixing stuff. And they have all that stuff, the ordnance trains, the artillery caisson, the artillery limbers, supply wagons. That all requires horses and mules, and so that's why you have those specialized guys attached to those units. The artillery even had a traveling forge, so you could actually hammer out a broken iron piece to go on a wagon or to go on a limber. Teamsters. I was surprised. I'm familiar with this term my whole life, but apparently students are not, because I threw this term out the other day and one of them raised their hand and said, "What's a Teamster?" And I said, "Well, it's the guys that go on strike when they don't want to drive trucks anymore." But it does come from that. In fact, if you look at the Teamsters Union logo, it has two horse heads on it. Teamsters are simply guys who drove horses. They can also be applied to ox teams, but Teamsters are literally wagon drivers. And they can be in just about any branch of service because everybody's relying on wagons, and that even goes through World War I. They could be military, or they could also be civilian contractors. And increasingly in the American Civil War, where you don't want all these Teamsters being detached from the infantry units, sometimes they would use contracted work to drive the horse and mule teams. And occasionally you will see, particularly, actually in both armies, both black and white Teamsters. Even in the Confederate Army, these may be enslaved people, but they are working for the Confederate Army as Teamsters. There was also you might see this occasionally in a record, where you see a guy's name and then you see WM behind it. That stands for Wagon Master, which means he's above the Teamsters. So that's not a term often used in the Confederate records, but it does show up occasionally in federal records. They even developed a special insignia for the wagon master. And it had WM on it and 2 crossed whips. Okay, a matros is a term you never see really outside of past the War of 1812, but that is an antiquated term by the Civil War, but that is a guy who mans cannons, okay? So you might see that in earlier records. Now, when we get to staff officers, that's where the fun and the confusion really begins, okay? And that's because the Army loves abbreviations, and they always have. The modern military and all of its acronyms, that's why we have Google, because half the time I can't figure them out, and I work kind of in this field, in military history field. But here are some, but certainly not all, that you might encounter. ADC, or aide de camp. An aide de camp is usually an aide, literally in camp, i.e. aide de camp, to a general officer. They are often paid, but sometimes they are just there as volunteers. The Army tried to dissuade generals from having too many aide-de-camps. Number one, they didn't want to pay for them, and number two, that's more mouths to feed. But a lot of times they're just malingerers, particularly in a volunteer army where you've got a lot of political officers, and he needs to take over or take off to war, and needs to take his best friend's nephew as a payment for political favor or a political payback. So you'll have a lot of aide-de-camps running around. In the Confederate Army, at least, they were often family members or family members of other officers. And a very good example of this are these 2 young men right here. This one is William Mecklenburg Polk. He is Leonidas Polk's youngest son. He is a nephew of President James K. Polk. And this man is Samuel Donaldson Jr. His father was General Donaldson, who Fort Donaldson is named for, and he is a nephew of Andrew Jackson. I love this image because how often do you see 2 nephews of 2 presidents sitting together? But here they are in the Confederate Army when they were both serving on General Leonidas Polk's staff. Now, the problem is, if you're not familiar with Leonidas Polk, as the Civil War historian Richard McMurray once said, Leonidas Polk, who was a little overweight and a little aged during the Atlanta campaign, managed to get perforated by a 3-inch ordnance shell on Pine Mountain. In other words, he took a direct body shot from a 3-inch ordnance shell. But the question is, what happens to these staff officers, particularly aide-de-camps, who are really tied to a specific officer and don't have another role within the Army? So a lot of times, they have to look around to see if somebody else will let them come and be on their respective staff. And that happened with these guys. I can't recall what happened to Polk, but Donaldson ends up on the staff of Nathan Bedford Forrest. So, you have this happen as well. So here's kind of the beginning. So you've got AG, that's the Adjutant General, i.e. he's the Chief of Staff or a Chief Clerk. CA, if you see that abbreviation, that's Chief of Artillery. A Chief of Artillery is usually only going to be around if you have a full Army command. Chief of Ordnance. Chief of Ordnance, make sure you get your artillery shells, make sure you have your ammunition. So you're going to have a CO, a Chief of Ordnance. You could have a COC. That does not stand for Church of Christ. That is the Chief of Cavalry. You could have an IG, which is your Inspector General. The JAG, which is the Judge Advocate General, because yes, on Army command level, they did have legal advice being rendered, but also those guys would oversee court-martials. So you have a JAG Corps. You see CS, let's say you're looking through a Union soldier's record and you see CS. It doesn't mean that he was a turncoat and joined the Confederate Army. It means he was in the commissary of subsistence, okay? Paymer, or you could even sometimes see PM, but that's usually paymaster. But that could also reference a PM, could also be PM, which will be provost marshal. If you're not familiar with what the provost marshal did in the Civil War in the 19th century, that is essentially their version of the military police. So an Army command, let's say you've got Schofield's Army, Army of the Ohio, he's going to have a provost marshal that is appointed, and that guy is going to maintain order and discipline and make sure the camp is secure. He's going to also make sure that if there's a general officer that's giving him problems and Schofield needs to arrest him, the provost marshal is going to go out and arrest him, okay? So it is kind of like the military police in that regard.
Would he handle the deserters? Or is that someone else?
It would depend on where the deserter, the question was, what about deserters? It would depend on where the deserter was. If a guy was trying to leave camp and was still in the immediate area of an army, it would be the provost marshal. Most of the time, though, a provost marshal is dealing like, let's say you got an army camped here on the outskirts of Knoxville and some of the boys sneak into town and get rip-roaring drunk. Provost marshal is going to be the one to arrest them, things like that. There is another body, and it could be, it just depends on the circumstances. Yes, they could sometimes deal with deserters. Confederate's going to create a whole nother role for deserters here. We're going to talk about that in a second. PUR is purveyor. In other words, this is a man that is part of the army that is purchasing things. Quartermaster. Quartermaster is responsible for clothing, generally speaking. Top, if you see that is topographical engineers. Sometimes you will see TE for topographical engineers. And then add to all this confusion, in front of these abbreviations, you could have acting, assistant, additional, or deputy, okay? So, and I ran across this record not too long ago. It was the DAAG.
Deputy Acting Assistant.
Deputy Acting Assistant Adjutant General. You got it, okay? But I've also seen AADC, which would be additional aide de camp, okay? So you've got a whole lot of things that you can throw in front of this terminology that can really make your life miserable. I have a handout to help you, which is from another great source, which is the Historical Register and Dictionary of the United States Army. And there in the front of it, he provides most of the abbreviations. And it's 2 pages worth. So I have a few of these if you want to take some. But occasionally there will be one that shows up that he doesn't even list, and then you're just kind of a little bit bewildered. Other terms that are often abbreviated or encountered that are very confusing. How many of you have heard the term ensign? How many of you think it's only a Navy term? Oh, it would be so easy if it was just a Navy term, okay? Because the Army also used the term ensign for a while. And it depends on different things depending on the time period. So an ensign in the War of 1812 in the U.S. Army is actually the man who carries the regimental colors or the national colors, because that is an ensign. Anybody know our most famous ensign from East Tennessee?
You're talking about a color guard now? Is that what we're going to call them later?
Well, he's actually literally the guy that carries the flag.
Yes.
The color guard guards him, okay?
Oh,
Sam Houston is the
Color
most
bearer
famous
is what I think.
ensign
That's color bearer.
from East Tennessee because he was carrying the flag for a while of the 39th U.S. Infantry. In the Confederate Army, they fought, as time was going forward, in a company level. You have a company commanded by a captain, then you have a first lieutenant and a second lieutenant. But due to increasing casualty rates and the inability to get guys trained as officers quick enough, they decided to create a term or a third lieutenant position. But they didn't call it a third lieutenant, they called it an ensign. Okay? So occasionally you'll see a guy in a Confederate regiment that will be listed as ensign or ENS, and you're like, what the heck is that? Well, this is probably a third lieutenant, for all intents and purposes, who is training to step in should a high officer get killed or wounded, okay, or promoted. Another term you'll run into, USV, United States Volunteers. You will see that a lot in Union Army records. You will also see that a lot in Spanish-American War records. And that is to designate U.S. volunteers to make sure you know that is not a regular Army unit. Also, you will see USVV, and that is United States Veteran Volunteers. That only appears in the Union Army, and that was because at the end of 1863, early 1864, the Union Army had enlisted a lot of their regiments, and their enlistments were running out. And the Union Army has a major problem on its hands if all of its veteran units decide not to re-enlist. It was really going to hurt Sherman's army, who's encamped here in East Tennessee and about to embark on the Atlanta campaign. It's a crisis. So the War Department's coming up with all sorts of gimmicks to try to get units as a whole to re-enlist. So there's a number of things they offered. On the individual level, they offered re-enlistment bonuses. But they also said if you get a certain percentage of your regiment to commit to re-enlist for the duration of the war, we will apply to your unit status the term veteran, which means when you're the 17th Indiana Veteran Volunteers and a new unit comes up from Indiana and they have just gotten to the scene, you can boast that you're a veteran unit, that you've been there, you've seen the elephant, you've been there for a while. Everybody kind of understand that, okay? So you'll see USVV. They took a lot of pride in that veteran status, okay? The other thing you will see in the Union Army, VR or VRC, that is Veteran Reserve Corps. And the Veteran Reserve Corps they created because they had a lot of job duties that really didn't require frontline units, but you also had increasing numbers of guys coming back from the front who may have some sort of disability that may prevent them from being in the frontline unit, but they could still stand guard duty somewhere or maybe serve at a hospital. So they create the Veteran Reserve Corps, the VRC. They had special uniforms. Some of them end up guarding prison camps, kind of rear echelon duties. They're still military, but they're not down there trying to march on Atlanta, okay? Then the other one you've probably seen, United States Colored Troops, but you could also see as USC ART or USC CAV or USC INF, which would mean artillery, cavalry, or infantry, okay? All right, as we get closer and closer to the present, you could also see USAR, you could also see USAFR, USMCR, or USNR, which stands for reserves, okay? United States Marine Corps Reserves, United States Navy Reserves. Again, that designates them from being different from the regular standing army, okay? And then another Civil War term that we encounter, the USMRR. This is the United States Military Railroad. The Union Army figured this out pretty quick, that if you're going to have all these different independently owned railroads, but you need them to work together, you're going to have to put them under military umbrella. And that's what they created, the United States Military Railroad. It is a quasi-military, quasi-civilian operation. Most of the commanders are civilians who took a commission in the United States Military Railroad. All right, let's see. Some other oddities you might encounter. Regular armies are always going to outrank volunteers or militia officers unless they have a stipulation from the War Department or the Department of the Navy, okay? Regular Army officers can become officers of volunteer forces, but then when the situation ends and the volunteer forces go away and they stay active duty, they revert back to their rank in the regular Army. So the most famous case of this is George Armstrong Custer, who everybody wants to call General Custer. He wasn't. He was a General Custer in the United States Volunteer Forces, but as soon as the war ends and he goes out to fight the Sioux, he's actually Lieutenant Colonel Custer. And he actually got promoted. If he'd gone back to his pre-war rank, he would have been a lieutenant, okay? So keep that in mind too. You will encounter that. Anybody ever heard of a brevet rank or BVT? That is extremely confusing. Brevet ranks were given for meritorious service usually, or sometimes simply given because you'd stuck around long enough, right? They don't really mean a whole lot unless you have two guys show up, both trying to take command. So let's say a colonel walks in from this door, another colonel comes in on this side, and they are appointed at roughly the same time, so they decide who's going to be in command of this room. Well, do you have a brevet? Yes, I have a brevet. What's the date of your brevet? Oh, my brevet predates yours. So guess what? I'm in control, right? Brevet ranks, you'll see those occasionally. They could have something to do with their retirement check, so that gets to be important too, right? Other terms that will be thrown around at times during the U.S. military. Voltigeers, sappers, miners, mechanics, and engineers. These are all units that were raised for short term or in cases longer term to assist the Engineer Corps. Right? The Engineer Corps is made up of officers. And generally officers, no offense to any officers here in this room, they don't like to get their hands dirty. So if you got 3 miles of trenches to be dug, is it the engineers that are going to actually pick up the shovels? No, the engineer is just going to show you where that trench line should go. So that's why you get these things created at various times, all right? And today it's the equivalent of modern combat engineers, enlisted combat engineers. The Confederacy creates this thing called the Bureau of Niter and Mining, which seems like an odd thing for the military to take on, but in an effort to create a new nation and create the resources that go along with carrying out warfare, you need to be able to find things like saltpeter, you need to find niter, you need to be able to find iron ore. So the Confederacy actually creates a separate bureau for that. They are underneath the Ordnance Department. This man right here is Colonel Hunt, who of Memphis, Tennessee. He is an officer in the Niner and Mining Bureau of the Confederate Army throughout the Civil War. And then you were asking about deserters. Well, the Confederacy creates a bureau, and it's called the Conscript Bureau. And what they are responsible for is two things. Number one, you've put into act the Conscription Act, so you got to go out and you got to make sure those guys show up. You got to go retrieve them, in some cases actually arrest them, particularly when the Confederates try to conscript East Tennesseans into the Confederate Army that don't want to be in the Confederate Army. But also they are given the job of rounding up deserters. So the Conscript Bureau actually gets to be fairly powerful. And the Conscript Bureau chief for Tennessee is none other than former Gideon Pillow of Murray County. Then you also have Home Guard. These are truest sense citizen soldiers. They never really left their home counties. They are really there in the absence of other civil authority to maintain peace or to maybe run off guerrillas, protect bridges, rail lines, and things like that. Irregular warfare. Oh, this is whole. Basically, spies, scouts, guerrillas, bushwhackers, partisans, and rangers. All those terms are used during the Civil War. They all kind of much refer to the same thing, but that's different because before the Civil War, spies and scouts were actually, the spy part was not actually guys that dressed up like the enemy. Spies and scout units were actually guys who were literally taking out binoculars or a spyglass and literally spying and scouting for the army. Okay, so you might see that too. All right, we've covered a lot. Yeah.
Could bushwhackers be paid by the regular army? Would they pay?
Not theoretically. It doesn't mean that they occasionally wouldn't. It gets really, really murky. But generally speaking, bushwhackers were not supposed to be on the payroll of any given army. The problem is a lot of people writing the reports about bushwhackers don't know whether because they don't see them ever. They're like, oh, well, okay. So a good example of that is John Hunt Morgan's units that were operating in northern Middle Tennessee for a good part of the war. Well, the Union occupation commander is constantly referring to those as bushwhackers. Well, they weren't bushwhackers. They were actually regular Confederate cavalry, but because they never laid eyes on them, because they'd attack and then disappear back into the woods, to his knowledge, he's being attacked by bushwhackers or guerrillas. Now, if you captured one and he's in civilian clothes, that makes it a little bit more obvious. But that even gets confusing because at certain times, particularly with Confederate cavalry, so they're in civilian clothes anyway. So it gets really, really murky. That probably doesn't answer your question, but theoretically, and according to most of the military legalese of the time period, a bushwhacker is somebody operating outside the normal rules of war and therefore could be treated differently, not as a prisoner of war.
What about the Signal Corps?
Signal Corps. So yes, they have a Signal Corps. Signal Corps is created actually I can't remember exactly when, certainly in place by the Civil War.
Definitely, yeah.
They are, again, a lot of them bringing into the field capabilities that they had in civilian life, particularly as the Signal Corps increasingly uses telegraph. So it's really better if you can go recruit a telegraph operator to come in instead of having to train somebody from brand new. But yeah, you would see Signal Corps, they had their own insignia by the end of the Civil War, at least in the Union Army. Confederate Army had a Signal Corps too, but it was not quite as formalized as on the Union side.
Did they have like an SG or something on their?
They have an usually an SC. Sometimes it could also be USC for US Signal
It's
Corps.
an ugly three-letter word.
USC.
Is it ever?
Are you talking about the school in California, or the one on the other side of the mountains?
The one in Watts.
Oh, okay.
I went to the one in Bel Air.
Oh, I gotcha. But you could also have USSS, which is United States Sharpshooters. Those were actually organized during the Civil War. There's all kinds of abbreviations that just, it's kind of mind-boggling, honestly. So if you encounter these terms, number one, don't always rely on what somebody tells you, particularly on social media, because I have found, particularly observing some of the Civil War image sites, people will put up images and people will tell them that that's what that abbreviation means, and about 70% of the time they are completely off base. But yes, ma'am.
My question concerns an individual person who lived in southeastern Tennessee in the 1830s and 40s and is constantly referred to as CAPT, C-A-P-T.
Okay.
CAPT. And this person was born in the 1790s, so I surmise perhaps he served in the War of 1812, but no record. And I'm wondering to what extent CAPT could be either just an honorific for someone in their 50s or whether it refers to one of these militias.
So CAPT is obviously an abbreviation for captain. It could be any of the above. Most likely it is a reference to a militia appointment, but a lot of the state militia records prior to the War of 1812 are not complete, particularly when it comes to who got commissions. And sometimes guys had commissions or thought they had commissions and it never got through the legislature. And so they didn't even, and even the local people may have assumed they were the captain of the militia company. But sometimes it just never got officially approved. So yeah, I mean, or it could have been something, of course, 1830s.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
He could have been a riverboat captain,
A what captain?
a riverboat captain, or a boat captain.
Oh, really?
There's always that option that it comes from civilian life as well. I think that's probably not the case, but it's a possibility. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yes.
I have a question that's kind of off topic a little bit, but I had two of my great-grandfathers were in the Civil War. One was with Grant at Shiloh and Vicksburg, and the other one quickly died of measles. How can an ordinary tax-paying citizen get into the National Archives?
What was the question?
How can you get into the National Archives? They're open every day, or at least.
You can go through the archives, or they're open to stand at a desk and wait till somebody wanders by.
Well, it's been years since I've been there, but I mean, they do research requests. You can go there.
Oh, no, they don't. Dear God in heaven.
There's a lot of those records too that are increasingly available through Fold 3.
Yeah, I've been through Fold 3.
I was gonna say, we had an employee here that went recently, and I think they're still backlogged from the pandemic, and you have to make an appointment.
But you can get in.
Yes, she went.
Did she get anybody to help her?
Yeah.
How did she make the appointment?
I'm not
I
sure.
call the National Archives, and some woman answers, so yes, let me send you right through. And so I go right, the next phone rings, after it rings about 9 times, it says, stop calling this number, no one ever answers it.
If you go to their website, there's a process to go through, just like the state archives to make it.
And I will tell you this, if you're looking for World War I and World War II service records, those are not kept at the National Archives.
No, they're in St. Louis.
They're in St. Louis. But there are more available than you might realize. And they have actually gone through a process of starting to recover some of the burn records.
Really?
And more than they've ever been in the past, the National Record Center is open for researchers. I tried 20 years ago to get some records from a guy who served in the interwar years between World War I and World War II, and never, ever got a response. However, I've had a friend of mine who's been up there in the last 2 weeks who went up there and got everything he requested and done in a day. So they are much more user-friendly than they've ever been.
They sure didn't used to be.
A question, early on you mentioned that Tennessee has digitized the records that, because they have the local, they go with the local. Do all states have that? Do all states have or do you know?
Do all states have?
You said they have local records for the DD-240.
No, I mean, the DD-214s, if you're not familiar with those are supposed to be filed when a veteran returns with a local court. And so it's really up to the counties about how they want to make those available. I'm glad that Knox County is digitizing them, because there are many counties that don't even give access to them at all. Because their argument is that those records really were never intended for public consumption, and they can have Social Security numbers on them and all sorts of things.
But if your records didn't burn in St. Louis, the DD-214's in them.
Might be the only thing that's left. But I also encourage you to always check with your state repositories too, because sometimes the states have records of their military troops that may not exist somewhere else.
Now, when you say...
For example, Tennessee did a really, really good job of trying to get veteran responses after World War I. So there's a lot of information at the State Library and Archives from World War I records that you may not be able to get out of St. Louis, but there may be something at the Library and Archives in Nashville. But that's specifically to Tennessee. I couldn't speak to other states.
Yeah, we're both from other states.
Yeah. Used to know a little bit about Georgia records, but it's been a minute. But any other questions, comments, thoughts? Well, thank you guys again. If you have more questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. I think, Adam, they do have copies of my books for sale in the shop. I'll be glad to sign them. If you happen to have an ancestor in the 4th Army Corps and may have been camped at Belmont Mansion, I'll be glad to sell you a ball cap. Also pick up our membership information and our brochures about Belmont. But thank you for being an attentive audience. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Myers. We appreciate it. And if folks would like to visit the museum today, feel free to do so. We have a new exhibit up on Carl and Pearl Butler, and also Archives and McClung are both open today as well. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon.